was lovely. Thank you, Alex. So today's message is religious nuns, the trends of de-churching today. I began seminary in what was called the Social Transformation Program. I had no intention of becoming a minister. I was planning to work in more of an interfaith, values-based nonprofit work, and that's what that degree was all about. My path into ministry is a whole nother story, but much of this shift happened when I was working full-time, I was going to school full-time, I was in practicums, I had no social life. And then 3 months after I took the job of minister, this global pandemic shut down the rest of my social life. So for a couple of years, we didn't really go out much. Last year was like the first time I found myself at a bar. I was in Montana with my brother visiting him, and he introduced me to a random group of his friends. And they said, "So what do you do?" And I said, "I'm a minister." And they were like, "Oh." Okay. And so it was the first time that I'd introduced myself to a group of strangers in that way, and I'd literally forgotten that ministry and religion has so much suspicion, has so much weight that it carries, that literally it's causing people to step away. So today I'd like to step into that conversation and all of its complexity with curiosity that is often left out when the kind of polarity of this conversation where you have what they call the machine gun atheists who just want to destroy it all, and the fervently faithful who are convinced that the moral character of the country and humanity rests on people going to their particular church in greater numbers. So we'll try to leave that duality and just engage curiously with the trends that we see, with people's voices and what they are reporting. In 1954, the words "under God" were officially added to the Pledge of Allegiance of the United States. Some people think that those words were always there. As a historian friend of mine pointed out, to reference anything about the 1950s is not a good reference because it was the most absurd decade of this country's history. There's nothing like it. So it's hard to say there was anything normal about that time. But it was a time of religious belonging, especially within the Protestant denominations. It was synonymous with being patriotic as the Cold War was happening, but it wasn't just people feeling pulled to religion. We understand also that if you weren't going to a Christian church, you might be labeled a communist. And so out of threat, people may have also been attending and identifying as Christian. But it's a little bit ironic that today, Christianity's association with right-wing politics is one of the leading factors for why Americans report that they are leaving religion. This was one of the findings shared in the New York Times 5-part series exploring religious nuns. And when I say nuns, I mean N-O-N-E-S, not the monastic N-U-N-S. It's kind of fun that those two words also sound so similar. So a religious nun is one that just does not have a religious affiliation. And you know, when you get those surveys that say check 1, Buddhist, Christian, Protestant, Catholic, Hindu, there's also a box for none. And in the 1950s, the people that checked that box was around 2%. And last year, when they did that survey, it was closer to 20%. And so it is now considered the largest growing, the fastest growing religious affiliation in the US is a religious nun. In seminary, there was always a little ripple of anxiety every time we discussed church closings. The news, as it is reported, is grim. I mean, you're talking about 6,000 to 10,000 churches closing every single year in America, and that's been happening for quite a while. And what's even more perplexing is that there isn't a simple reason for why this is happening. The trends are across socioeconomic spectrums, they're across generations, they're across identity groups, and they're across geographic regions. Ryan Berg is the author of The Nuns, where they come from, who they are, and where they're going. And he acknowledges, I can't point to a single causal mechanism for the nuns' astronomically growing numbers, and no other academic can either. But what Jessica Gross pointed out in her articles was that what's lost in the polling data, and subsequently most reporting and conversations about this, is that religious belonging or religious affiliation does not actually tell the story of our relationship to religiousness or being spiritual. So she writes that some who identify as nuns, and others have written about this as well, but that they have left all beliefs. They have possibly, gathered the identity of atheist, but not even necessarily. They might have an identity that just says that there's nothing about religion that makes sense, and there's nothing that I believe in at this point. But that is actually a fraction, less than a quarter of those who responded to surveys about why they identify as religious nuns. Most people, 3/4 of those who identify in that way, have some kind of individual spiritual beliefs, practices, and some of those are retained from traditions that they were brought up in. Some of those have been gathered through other methods. But she does recognize that issues such as abortion and same-sex marriage are one of the things that are driving people away from Christianity, which is still the dominant religion across America, and that is where you're seeing these huge swings of what they call de-churching. So this is where someone for their life or for a long time has attended a house of worship for a period of time, and this isn't exclusive to Christianity, it's happening across religions, but again, because that is the dominant, that's where a lot of the big numbers are, people are leaving those experiences. So that's captured in this word de-churching. And one of the new trends that's happening is that people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s are de-churching. That wasn't seen before. It was sort of like once you were in religion, you were in, and you sort of like went all the way through, or maybe you changed a few different affiliations. But these groups of people are saying, it's socially acceptable to not be affiliated with a house of worship, and I didn't even want to go in the first place, or I just went because I felt pressured to do so, or because a spouse wanted to do so, and that today it's socially acceptable to not go, and so that is kind of a new whole group of people that are being this de-churched word. But the largest affiliation of religious nuns are those who did not grow up attending any kind of religious or house of worship, and they are referred to as unchurched. I hate these words, just so you know. Based on current trends, given that more and more families are not going to church or going to any house of worship, that group will likely continue. So we'll see additional religious nuns coming from those groups. I would say that even in Unitarian Universalism, the vast majority of people I come in contact with grew up Jewish, grew up Christian, grew up with an indigenous or other faith-based tradition that they practiced as a family, and then have found UU to be their current spiritual home. But there are always a few that have never had any kind of, they were brought up in without any kind of religious orientation, and often they come and they're very curious, and they want to know. One young mother came up to me and said, "How do I raise my son? I feel like I'm missing something that all my other friends have, and they got it because they were brought up in a church." And I assured her that she would be just fine, but that we could also talk about whatever she was having concerns with. But that is also some people who have not been brought up have a curiosity. Where do I find sort of the moral code? How do I pass on my values to the next generation? So to summarize, we've got religion and politics, we've got issues like abortion and same-sex marriage rights, we've got social norms, we haven't even talked about scandal and abuse, we've got terms like de-churched and unchurched to talk about our deepest held values and the way of being in the world. Is there any wonder why this is such an inflammatory topic? But one of the main takeaways from Jessica Gross's reporting was that whether one attends a fellowship, a church, a mosque, a temple, a friends meeting, or any house of worship, that one of the key benefits of religion that is not going away is the fellowship of community. Those who find and create community in sports or exercise groups may have a hint of this, and many of those people wrote in. And one interviewee shared, a soccer team just doesn't quite provide that spiritual solace in the face of death. It doesn't have a weekly charitable call, and there's no sense of connection to a heritage that goes back generations. It's not something that's shared, say, between a grandparent and a grandchild. This is just one of the many ways that religious community is unique. And Jessica Gross concludes, her conclusion on it was that there is no secular community. There is no kind of organized group that replicates what happens in religious community, but she thinks that it's possible. And she thinks that it's probable that we should create this to suit modern life. I don't want to say I'm opposed to that idea, but I wonder if we aren't essentially just then creating another religion. Novelty is kind of the way of the seeker, and there's a lot of seekers out there. That's also a fairly common people who identify maybe as religious nuns, but even more so as spiritual but not religious. About a quarter of people with that identity consider themselves seekers and are interested in exploring religions, but not necessarily, haven't maybe found a spiritual home that has rooted them. The spiritual but not religious, one of the interesting aspects of that group, a social scientist and Methodist minister, Linda Mercadante, found that there was remarkably similar beliefs from person to person when she did her interviews. And it made her wonder if perhaps it wasn't that these were individuals just coming up with their own ideas, but if we aren't witnessing a whole new religious tradition, a theological tradition in the making that is currently being held by the spiritual but not religious. She said that they were most interested in examining practices and ideas of the sacred, human nature, and the afterlife, and almost everyone she talked to had those three things in common. She wrote, many SBNR, spiritual but not religious, people I met will hope that we will achieve new cultural consensus, belonging, oneness, peace, earth care, humanity, human dignity, freedom, and equality. Yet her work in community also required her to ask, but how likely is that without the roots and soil that nurture commonly held values and the structures to support and pass them to subsequent generations? So she is asking the question, do we need religious tradition? Do we need these things in order to actually accomplish shared values? So if religious community offers something that can't be found anywhere else, and I would say I'm always astounded by the health and spirituality studies that are going on that show that people who attend church across the board are living longer, have lower rates of depression, have lower have lower blood pressure, that often there are just all of these health benefits to being affiliated with a religion. There are all these different social science studies that share similar things as related to the ways in which we connect with others. So it's unclear, the research isn't conclusive why that is happening, but several studies confirm it. And if we know that a religious tradition can root the spiritual work that can transform the world, and you can insert your own example here, perhaps Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi, I'm always curious why religious nuns or the spiritual but not religious don't get involved in religions to try to make change from the inside. What is it about, say, the UP Wild Church that we were talking about at the worship committee? What is it about that group that's forming and interested in organizing when there's a UU church in the region, which is considered one of the most organized religions in the world? Now, This group, I gave a children's message where I asked the kids, when was the last time you saw a group of adults chasing butterflies in the afternoon? And the adults were so offended in this group. They were like, I chase butterflies. Your children's message was wrong. I was like, yes, I get it. While some traditions restrict what we can believe, what the creeds, and even restrict how people can participate and who can participate, there is this kind of interesting governance called congregational polity. Congregational polity is where all of the decision-making authority actually lies within the individual community that gathers. It is found in sects of Christianity, Judaism, and Unitarian Universalism. Unitarian Universalism is a little bit unique because it's a pluralistic religion, which means that there is no prescribed beliefs, but the idea is that we come together to learn how to live with the variety of beliefs that we all carry. After all, when we talk about a religion, there is no such thing. What we're really talking about is millions of things. But within congregational polity, it provides kind of this rich soil for novelty to exist. If we think about the ecological metaphor that we are all in relationship. If we aren't intentional about that, we're still in relationship, but we may just not be cultivating those relationships. Often in congregational polity requires what's called a covenant. If we are going to live without authority over us, without a hierarchical power, we have to have horizontal agreements from the heart to one another in terms of how we will live in right relationship, how we will engage in democracy, what sort of processes we will use to resolve conflict, because we all know that conflict is inherent in community. So the welcome of that possibility of entering into that sort of a religious tradition, of shaping it, of bringing energy, of bringing the spiritual but not religious ethos, seems indecipherable in the landscape of religion in America. Or perhaps maybe people do know about it, but the threshold of entering into relationship is not something many have ever experienced and could be too far of a leap from the personal authority that often characterizes spiritual but not religious and religious nuns. I just want to be very clear that for many years I identified as spiritual but not religious. I had just had it with organized religion. I had nothing left to give. I felt that it had betrayed me in so many ways. And I came back to organized religion sort of circuitously, but it was actually from a friend, sharing that she had joined the board of her Unitarian Universalist fellowship because she wanted to have spiritual community, but she was disgusted with how it was done in so many ways, and that she wanted to be a part of creating a different kind of community. And she explained congregational polity. She explained the living tradition, that literally reflection is part of the way in which we make meaning, that there isn't a set of beliefs or purposes that doesn't change from time to time. So I started very slowly attending a UU fellowship, and then I found this sweet little UCC church. It's like a one-room schoolhouse in the woods, and I met my mother-in-law there for several years, and I got to sit with people from all different beliefs, from people that I wouldn't meet anywhere else. We were working on things like keeping the library open and addressing things like children's hunger. These weren't things that I was working on in any of the many, many, many nonprofits that I was a part of. It was just something beyond what I got anywhere else. So I got a little bit more involved. I started working in religious education, and then I went to seminary, and oh my goodness, then I became a minister. And yes, people call me and they say, stop sending us your UU stuff. We kind of think of you as a summer camp. Okay. But other people call and they say, I can't tell you, I don't know how I would have made it through without my UU community. Henry Nouwen wrote that religion is the yes to a world that consistently asks us to say no. I believe our religious communities are a place where we can take the absurd, the rational and the irrational, the deepest pain, the loudest joys, and try to reconcile them in a way that allows us to say the yes that Henry Nouwen describes. It's where we can learn to live in community. Because we know that life brings a lot of no's, that nihilism and meaninglessness call and call again. After identifying for years as spiritual but not religious, I came back to religious community because it is where I keep finding the hope to say yes. We know from social science that religion has always and likely will always be around. We can engage deeper with curiosity about religion. We can leave the hyperbole and embrace the nuance. We can learn and experiment. And perhaps others will find, as I did, that congregational polity and a living tradition held my SBNR way of being and allowed me to have spiritual rootedness and connection and community that hopefully can be passed on to future generations. And because the possibilities for what religion is and what it can become are endless. So, Heartwood will now share another song, and then I'd love to hear your voices. I think we all would. This is such a rich conversation to have in community conversation. So as we listen to music, perhaps reflect on, do you identify with a religion or as religious? Why or why not? What do you see for the future of religion in America? What do you hope for?